welcome to Rebuilding Rob, the podcast, the show that is in the relentless pursuit of building a more perfect man. I am your host, your favorite blogger turned podcaster. My name is Rob. And this week, I'm going to tell you the story about the Great American Road Trip. Buckle up. All right, everybody, before we get into the meat and potatoes of this week's episode, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the success of my hometown NFL team, the Detroit Lions. Just over 48 hours ago, they beat the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in the second round of the NFC playoffs back on Sunday night. And for that, the Lions will advance now to the NFC Conference Championship game this coming Sunday in San Francisco, where they will play the 49ers. The winner of that game will go on to represent the NFC in the Super Bowl 2 weeks later in Las Vegas. Now, to say that this is a BFD to the residents of the Detroit metro area would be a colossal understatement. For those who aren't really aware of the collective pain and suffering of the Detroit Lions fan base, let me take you on a stroll down Amnesia Lane for a bit. Now, the Lions weren't always the mess that they have come to be known as for the last several decades. The Lions did enjoy some success in the 1930s and in the 1950s, culminating with an NFL championship win in 1957. Of course, today, modern football fans tend to look at the NFL and think that anything that happened prior to the first Super Bowl is ancient history and doesn't really count. So it's easy to understand why the Lions' success of the 30s and the 50s would be kind of more or less erased by history. So as I said, at 1957, that was the last NFL championship the Lions won, and at that point, that was the last time that they would be in the playoffs for several years. Now, in 1963, William Clay Ford, the grandfather of Henry Ford, yes, as in that Henry Ford, the card guy, purchased the Detroit Lions. In fact, if I recall correctly, I believe the purchase was completed the day after the Kennedy assassination in 1963. Now, one of the things about William Clay Ford was he didn't have a lot of the same business savvy, or ruthlessness, I should say, that his grandfather had. By all accounts, William Clay Ford was a nice guy, and he took care of his employees. People who were loyal to him stayed with the company for years and years and years. And while this was great for employee morale, it was kind of lousy for his football team. Unfortunately, Ford had a tendency to bring in guys who didn't really know a lot about putting together a winning football team. So the team floundered. They languished. They sat on the bottom of the standings for several years. Growing up here in Michigan, since we knew the Lions weren't going to the Super Bowl, we knew the Lions weren't going to the playoffs, really the only thing we had to look forward to was knowing that the Lions would take center stage before a national television audience on Thanksgiving Day. The Thanksgiving game has really been the hallmark of Lions football pretty much ever since they started playing the game back in the 1930s. And it was something that William Clay Ford cared very much about keeping. There was some talk for a few years that the NFL wanted to go to a rotating schedule where they would have other teams play on Thanksgiving. Ford said no. The NFL caved on it because the Ford Motor Company is one of the largest sponsors for the National Football League. So, as money talks, this is one thing the NFL was willing to let the Lions hang on to. So, that brings us up to the 1989-1990 football season, when the Lions drafted for Barry Sanders, the number one overall pick on the draft. As some of you may know, Barry Sanders went on to become, in my opinion, the greatest running back to ever set foot on an American football field. and that is with all due respect to Mr. Jim Brown and Mr. Walter Payton. Barry did more with less than either Jim Brown or Walter Payton managed to do. And if you've never seen Barry Sanders play, do yourself a favor. Get on YouTube and just put in a YouTube search for Barry Sanders highlights. You're going to be pleasantly surprised, I promise. So, with Barry Sanders as running back, the Lions did enjoy some measure of success. They made their first trip to the playoffs since 1957, back in the year 1991. 1991 also was the year that featured the Lions' only playoff victory to that point. They were able to skip the first round because they won their division outright. I believe it was the Dallas Cowboys they defeated, and then they went on the next week to get annihilated by the Washington Redskins in the NFC Championship game. Now, I could get into the whole story about what ultimately happened with Barry Sanders abruptly retiring from the Lions. There's an Amazon movie on Amazon Prime Video called Bye Bye Barry that you should check out. It really gets into great detail about that. But once Barry was gone, that was pretty much it for the Lions and the Lions fan base. We were all excited about Barry. We were all excited about the Lions' brief flirtation with postseason football. But even us Lions fans knew that Barry Sanders was really all we had. There wasn't really much more to the team. And unlike the NBA, the NFL is not a league, and football is not a sport where one player can carry offense, defense, and special teams. It just doesn't work. The Lions were never really able to build around Barry. So again, the Lions went back to languishing for several years. Now, for many years, particularly back in the 1980s, the Oakland/Los Angeles Raiders and their owner, Al Davis, were known for a slogan that Davis had coined with the team, which simply said, "Commitment to excellence." For me, it became kind of a long-running joke that if the Raiders' slogan was "Commitment to excellence," the Lions' slogan was probably "Commitment to mediocrity" or "Commitment to incompetence." The Lions ultimately hit rock bottom in 2008 as they became the first team in NFL history to record 0 wins and 16 losses. At the time, sports pundits thought it was impossible. They thought the NFL was foolproof. They figured that the NFL was so level, had so much parity within the league, that any team could beat any other team on any given Sunday. Well, not the 2008 Lions. They lost to everybody. That was pretty much it for the Lions. They had hit their rock bottom. Now, growing up in Michigan, we have always been really fortunate in that we are a 4-sports city in Detroit. We have the Tigers in Major League Baseball, we have the Lions in the NFL, we have the Pistons in the NBA, and we have the Red Wings in the National Hockey League. Also, with the University of Michigan and Michigan State University, we have 2 very competitive college programs on the national level. And the neat thing about this area is, at pretty much any given time, one team or another was usually winning, was usually enjoying some sort of success, except for the Lions. Recently, though, the Detroit Tigers' fortunes turned around 2013 or so, and they gradually started to make their descent to the bottom of the American League Central. The Detroit Pistons had a World Championship win in 2004, never really got back to that level after that, and currently, as of this recording, the Pistons have 4 wins on their season, and they are on pace to finish the year with the worst performance in NBA history. The Detroit Red Wings enjoyed a run where they appeared in the NHL playoffs for 25 straight seasons. They won 3 Stanley Cups. And Detroit, for a long time, called itself Hockey Town. People had Red Wings gear everywhere. There were Red Wing decals on everyone's cars. They were really the big thing. But like all sports dynasties, that came to an end. Currently, Steve Yzerman, who himself is a Red Wings legend, is the general manager of the team, and he is definitely on his way to rebuilding the team. He has a pedigree of success, having produced a Stanley Cup winner for the Tampa Bay Lightning. But I think right now it would seem that the Red Wings' return to glory is a little bit sidetracked. Michigan State University, what can I say about them? All you need to do is look at the headlines and see how much they've gotten bad publicity over the last few years. Not even just the football team. I'm not even going to go down that rabbit hole. But the University of Michigan, this past January, won the College Football National Championship. So at least finally, we had a winning team in town. And the Lions have been on their rise as well. So fast forwarding to 2014, the longtime Lions owner William Clay Ford passed away, and controlling interest in the Lions was passed to his wife Martha, and ultimately she stepped down, and their daughter Sheila assumed day-to-day responsibilities of running the Lions organization. Sheila was bound and determined to change the Lions' ways. She brought in a new general manager, a new team president. She cleaned up the entire front office. They had hired Dan Campbell as their head coach. Campbell, of course, was a member of that notorious 0-16 2008 Lions team. But the foundation had already been laid. The plan was to redefine the Lions culture. 3 years later, the Lions are 60 minutes away from a Super Bowl appearance. I'm trying desperately not to get myself too excited or get my hopes up too high for the game this Sunday. All I can say is, if the Lions manage to win on Sunday, this town is going to go crazy. We already had the Wolverines win the College Football National Championship this year, so regardless of whatever the Lions do this Sunday, this has already been the greatest season of American football that the state of Michigan has ever seen. At this point, there's not much left to say besides, go Lions. Ford's wife, Martha, took over the team, and eventually their daughter, Sheila, had assumed the day-to-day owner responsibilities for the franchise. They made some new hires. They brought in a entirely new front office, and Sheila Ford decided to let her front office people run the team. She did not meddle. She did not interfere. And the front office decided to let their coach, Dan Campbell, coach. So we've gradually been watching this building over the last few years. And we've gotten to the point that we are now. And unlike the Lions team of those early 1990s seasons, this current Lions roster is the most rounded and most complete squad I have ever personally seen the Lions field in my lifetime. I've lived in this state all but 12 years of my life, and I can tell you with conviction that I have never seen this region rally behind the Lions like they are right now. It is everywhere. It reminds me a lot of when the Detroit Tigers had their championship run in the early 2000s. I should say late 2000s. Honolulu Blue is everywhere. Go Lions signs are everywhere. Lions billboards are everywhere. businesses are putting things on their marquees like "In Golf We Trust," a reference to Lions quarterback Jared Goff. It is really a sight to behold. And as I said, I've never seen the Lions enjoy this much success in my life. I don't know if I'll ever see it again. I sincerely hope that this is the start of a run or a dynasty, as people like to say in the sports terms. But definitely between this run that the Lions are on this year and the fact that the University of Michigan won the NCAA College Football National Championship, this has been, without question, the greatest season of American football that the state of Michigan has ever seen. And this comes at a pretty unusual time in the overall moment that is Detroit sports. Detroit is one of the nearly dozen four-sport major league cities in America, which is to say that we have an MLB team in the Tigers, we have an NFL team in the Lions, we have an NBA team in the Pistons, and we have an NHL team in the Red Wings. Between those four clubs and the University of Michigan, and even Michigan State University, at pretty much one time or another, there has always been somebody who was winning in Michigan sports, except for the Lions. But even the last 4 or 5 years have been a little rough. There wasn't really a lot of winning going on. The Tigers are in the middle of a rebuild themselves, and it seems like their owners don't really want to spend enough money to really turn the team into a contender. The Red Wings have Steve Yzerman, the longtime Red Wings legend, Stanley Cup winner. He is the team's current GM, and he is certainly on his way to bringing the Red Wings back to prominence. However, that too seems to be taking a little bit longer than maybe was expected. The Detroit Pistons are god-awful. You don't have to hear it from me. I think they've won 4 games this season. They had one stretch where they lost something like 25 games in a row. They are on pace to have the worst single season in NBA history by far. So this resurgence by the Lions, or I should say surgence by the Lions, because they never really had a first surgence to have a resurgence, but this has been long needed, long awaited, and people in town could not be happier about this. Okay, so a couple of weeks back on the old WordPress machine, I was given a prompt that asked me to talk about a road trip. Now, the open road, the road trip, the road experience has always been something that's been kind of romanticized in American culture. And I must admit that I'm a sucker for that idea of getting out on the open road. There's something about getting out of your surroundings, getting into a new place, and frankly being somewhere where no one knows your name. It's just very alluring, very, very appealing. And our great freeway and interstate system makes that so easy in this country. Well, at least as easy as it can be. So, back in 2003, I was still married at this point, 3 years in, with X1, and I was in the middle of student teaching at the time. X1 had finished her student teaching up earlier that summer, and she was kind of chomping at the bit to get a teaching job. Now, at this point in time, teaching jobs in Michigan were pretty hard to come by. The pay was, as I understood it, the second highest in the country. And not only that, but Michigan also had the lowest cost of living out of the top 5 paying states in America. When you factor into that also the fact that we have very strong labor unions in Michigan, or at least we did at the time, it all adds up to not a lot of teachers leaving the profession. So jobs were hard to come by. It got to a point here in Metro Detroit where I could hand in an application for an English position and I would literally be up against 500 other applicants. So much so that I think after a while it got to a point where it didn't even matter if you were the best applicant. It just was a matter of where your resume happened to be in the stack. So X1 and I were willing to kind of spread our wings and move out of state if we needed to. Now, she had gotten a teaching offer for a position in Vacaville, California, which, according to my handy dandy GPS, is about 2,400 miles from where I'm at outside of Detroit. 2,358 to be exact. So she had done a couple phone interviews and she was going to take the position. We had discussed this and we had made a decision that I was going to stay in Michigan. I was going to finish up my student teaching. I was going to kind of take care of affairs here. We had an apartment together at the time. And she was going to take the job in California. Basically, stay with another teacher at her school. She was going to sock money aside, maybe pay for her cell phone bill. That would be about it. And hopefully, I could eventually get a position out there myself and we would relocate out there permanently. That was the plan. And we'd agreed to this. We were both on board. We knew it was going to be hard. Obviously, we were going to be apart for about 3 months, half a country apart. But other people had done it. We figured we could too. So our plan was that we would drive out to California together and we would get X1 situated there. And once she was set up, I would fly back and I would basically get back to work and she would be working there. Now, as for the actual drive to California itself, it was really pretty much a blur. I wish I had kept a journal. I wish I had taken photographs. I wish I had more to talk about the actual trip out, because this was the Great American Road Trip. We were going to California. We did pass through Chicago, which is to say that we saw the city via I-94, which isn't really saying much. I mean, we saw the skyline in Chicago, and that was about it. Our commute actually had us going around Denver and around Salt Lake City in Utah, so we didn't really get to see those cities. There wasn't a whole lot to see in Iowa. There wasn't much more in Nebraska. One thing I do remember is making a road stop, a couple of different, road stops in Colorado, and noticing on the state established road stops, they would actually have signs marking ideal photo locations where you could set up, do a pose. They even had a little clearing and you could do a portrait and then have a impressive scenic backdrop behind you. And they were actually sponsored. I think like Kodak had ads on these signs. So this is something Kodak came in and they had, pointed out and set up. I remember walking up and down some of the hills in Colorado and thinking how out of breath and winded I was. Now, having watched football games that originated from Colorado, you may have seen where you'd see players on the sidelines and they would actually have little oxygen tanks once they started getting gassed, because the air is thinner in Colorado, particularly in Denver because of the Rocky Mountains. In fact, the city of Denver itself is roughly 1 mile above sea level, hence they called the Broncos' old football stadium Mile High Stadium. In fact, even today, the Colorado Rockies, the MLB team, it's one of the highest rows in their ballpark, but they have a row of seats that are purple, whereas the rest of the seats are dark green. The purple row indicates that is exactly 1 mile above sea level. So the air is thinner there. And it probably didn't help that I was out of shape. So there's always that. But as we got further out west, we got into Wyoming, and all I could think to myself was, there's really nothing here. Before the trip, I remember reading up and finding out that Wyoming actually has a smaller population than Alaska does. And perhaps I've seen too many road movies, suspense movies, where one character kills another character, then they put their body in the trunk of a car, and then they go out on the open road to find some place that they can bury the dead body and not get caught. Driving through Wyoming, all I could think to myself was, man, there's an awful lot of places out here to hide a dead body. It kind of scared me. Mind you, this is a guy who grew up in the shadows of Detroit, Michigan. Urban decay doesn't scare me as much as a whole lot of nothing. Driving through Nevada, there was one point on the freeway where we were actually passing alongside, I think it was an Air Force base. And they had said, last chance for gas for 50 miles, or maybe I think it was 20 miles actually. But there were signs indicating to us, basically saying, if you got to get gas, because for the next 20 miles it's going to be uninterrupted freeway because you're driving along side of a Air Force base. Wasn't Area 51, but, kind of got you thinking. Had those Area 51 kind of vibes to it, like they didn't want people stopping. So that was strange. We barely passed through Reno. I remember seeing signs for Reno proper, but Vegas was, so far south of where we're at, so it's not like we went through Vegas or anything. So, unfortunately, I didn't have the Jack Kerouac on the road experience. I don't have all these stories and anecdotes to tell you about what happened in this town and what happened in this town and how we got food and how we had to find a place to stay for the night. One thing I think really surprised me on the trip that we took was seeing, even in a place like Wyoming where there's a whole lot of nothing, pretty much all the property was fenced off. Even if it was just one of those rickety little fences, which is like, a horizontal slat every 10, 12 feet, that is propped up by two little X-shaped spikes. But it indicated to me that all the land that we passed was owned by somebody or something. Nothing was completely barren out in the open, untouched, anything like that. So I went back and did a little research, trying to remember what the technology world was like back in 2003. At that time, we were definitely carrying around digital cameras. Cameras being integrated into our cell phones did happen in 2003. In fact, according to Time magazine, roughly 6 million camera phones were sold in the United States in 2003. However, while I think I did have a camera phone at that point, I can tell you that even if I did, these weren't smartphones. Now, we had the capability of connecting our cell phones to a computer and then uploading a photo from the phone to the internet, but for me, usually that was too much work, and the pictures that were coming out on our phones were of such a crappy resolution that didn't really seem worthwhile. It, to me, always made more sense to use a traditional digital camera. But that definitely would explain the mystery of why I don't have any photos from this road trip. Alright, so after X1 and I had made it out to Vacaville, we had tried to do a whirlwind touristy thing in San Francisco. Didn't get to see Alcatraz, didn't even get to see the Golden Gate Bridge, but we did get to spend a little bit of time in the city. So we made it back to the house in Vacaville where she was staying, and we got ready to say our goodbyes. She was getting set up in a extra room that one of the teachers had in one of their houses, which, as I think back to it to this day, I think that was an incredibly cool gesture that teacher was willing to do for X1. She didn't know X1 from a hole in the wall, and I thought that was really a sweet thing to do. I just wanted to make, acknowledge of that. So early the next morning, we made our way to the airport. X1 drove. I was going to get on a plane. We said our goodbyes. It was hard. It was agonizing. We cried, "Ooh!" We went through all of it. Once I got on the plane, it felt pretty surreal. I mean, I felt horrible for the fact that X1 was staying there in California. But we had an apartment back in Michigan. I still had a class I was taking. I was still student teaching, which technically in and of itself is considered a class when you're in college. So I had things to do. We had dogs and cats at the time, so I had animals to tend to. And I remember going into work the next day, a little bit jet lagged, a little bit tired just from all the driving. It was kind of a surreal trip. It was a whirlwind. I think we did it basically in 2 days. I think we stopped overnight about halfway to California, and then we drove the rest of the next day. It was intense. But I remember being at work, and, before I had left California, her and I had had conversations where, like, if this isn't working, if you don't think you can do it, come home, we'll figure it out, etc., etc. So I had taught a couple of my classes as I was at a junior high at the time, and then I had my planning hour, so I was off, and I was talking to her, and she was really upset, and she was already talking about coming back to Michigan. And I told her, I wouldn't be upset if you came back. I miss you terribly. But, obviously give it some thought before you get in a car and decide to come back. So we had that conversation. And a couple hours later, it was my lunch break. And I got another call from X1. This time I could hear the wind on the road. If any of you remember early cell phones, how it was, you could tell when someone was talking while they're driving in the car because you could just hear the wind through the phone. And she had called and was telling me that she was already in Nevada at this point. She was driving home. And I was happy because I was just going to be happy to see her again, but at the same time I was kind of disappointed, disgusted a little bit, honestly, because of that long-ass trip that we made. But at that point I didn't really care. I was just glad she was coming home because I had already missed her terribly. So that was pretty much the extent of our great California adventure. X2 obviously has that one bragging right over me. I can tell people, hey, I made the Great American Road Trip. I went to California. Of course, X2 can say she'd made 2 trips because she made the trip back from California to Michigan on her own. It's typical. That was always her competitive nature. She probably loves the fact that she can still hang that over my head. Now, once X1 got back into Michigan, her and I didn't really talk about this whole California adventure very much afterwards. I think in the end, her and I looked back on it and decided, we can't say we didn't try it. Yeah, we wasted a ton of money over the span of just a few days, but at that point, we were just happy to be back together again. As it stood, X1 never even set foot inside the school that she was going to teach at in Vacaville. I don't think she even met her principal face to face. We did meet the one teacher who was going to be a coworker of hers because that was the house that X1 was going to be staying at. But in the end, I never had any malice or animosity towards her about this. She never held anything over my head. And why should she? It wasn't my fault she decided to come back. But I think this was just something we both agreed to do in order to improve our situation, and when the time came, we just weren't ready for it. Alright, well that's going to do it for this week's episode of the show. Tune in next week when I will be going a little bit outside the box. I have a story for you guys that has not appeared on my blog yet. In fact, it's been sitting in my draft box for the better part of a year. It involves men, women, children, lovers, saucy, and 2 cross-country vacations. I call it the Trojan War. So be sure to tune back in for that one. In the meantime, I would like to thank you all for dropping in and listening to me for the last 20 or 30 minutes or so. I know that you have a lot of listening options out here on the interwebs, so I do thank you for your time. And as always, you can follow my exploits on my blog at rebuildingrob.com. You can also check in with me on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, X, all under the username RebuildingRob. So, once again, my name is Rob. I am your favorite blogger turned podcaster, saying, see you next week.